Hi everyone, my name is Rochelle Johnson, and today I'll be sharing with you my presentation titled Would You Like to Save Your Game? Preserving the History of Video Games. Before we can get to the nitty gritty, allow me to tell you a story about why video games matter. Games in general have been integral to human identity and learning since humans first cultivated civilization. For example, late 13th century King Alfonso X of Castilla created a collection of texts known as the Libro de los Juegos, or the Book of Games. This book, via images, poems, and prose, utilizes board game maneuvers for games like chess in order to explore the complex philosophical themes in varying aspects of life at the time. There's also the instance of people like economist Dr. Matthew McCaffrey using massively multiplayer role-playing games, or MMOs, like World of Warcraft, to articulate and better analyze the effects of market factors like supply and demand and hyperinflation in order to give it a more concrete look outside of the more nebulous discussions. There's also the case of games like Nier Automata being used as a means of preserving identity in indigenous cultures. In this case, singer-songwriter for the game Emmy Evans revealed that one of the renditions of Weight of the World was sung in Chamikuro, a now extinct people and dormant language within South America that has thankfully been codified for people to enjoy. And lastly, there's the case of Final Fantasy XIV, another MMO, being used as a social hub throughout COVID-19 for things like dates, conventions, birthday parties, and even funerals, just to name a few. As you can see, video games, from their first inception in 1947 with the cathode ray tube amusement device, to their first true form in 1950 with Birdie the Brain, to their ubiquity in 1980s, have been an integral part of pop culture and history as a whole. In fact, the gaming industry is so important today that as of last fall, the industry is now worth over $108 billion, dwarfing the likes of the music industry and Hollywood. However, this success has not come without cons, as despite being a large multi-billion dollar industry, the industry has yet to actually save its past history, and it's currently falling at the seams due to time, neglect, complex legalese, or all the above. Their games are a cultural icon, one that deserves to be lauded, no different from things like the Sistine Chapel or the Mona Lisa. And in order to make sure that that is true, we need to have three things happen. Number one, studios need to embrace emulation technologies and not be so quick to employ harsh, outdated copyright law protections in order to keep the trust between them, the fans, and academics within gaming. Developers should also work to recruit historians, archivists, and museum creators in order to establish expansive interactive museums of play for generations to come. And lastly, scholars, particularly but not exclusively media studies and entertainment scholars, need to bridge the gap with other academics in traditional disciplines in order to show that video games are more than just a recreation tool, but can also provide knowledge in fields that we didn't actually think about as of yet. So before we get to any of those solutions, let's talk about the current state of gaming preservation. Currently, video game preservation has had a mix of decentralized efforts of varying success, and it's been mired with several issues regarding its feasibility. For example, Sony has graciously reminded fans that consoles are finite in their lifetime, as they themselves left a console-crippling bug in the system's architecture. Game consoles, like all tech, are intentionally made to be flawed and made cheaply, as these consoles generally have a lifetime of 5 to 10 years after being bought new. Many older games also require older tech, like CRT TVs, as those TVs were made alongside those games, and newer tech just can't really keep to the game's quality. As a result of these aging hardwares and better PC tech and inevitabilities of time, people like the Center of Computing History leader Jason Fitzpatrick have been supporting the highly controversial tech that is emulation. But what exactly is emulation? As defined by Sam Pettis, it's the process by which hardware or software behaves as if it's the actual console. and this is done in 3 flavors. There's soft emulation, which is when a program mimics the console itself. There's hard emulation, which is when an old console is shoved inside of a new console. And there's also the hybrid version, which combines the best of both worlds. And while these emulators aren't exactly illegal due to cases like Sega v Accolade, Sony vs. Kinetics, and Sony vs. Bleem proving as such, they each hang on the fair use doctrine, which isn't exactly promising, as copyright law hasn't been renewed or updated since 1998, far beyond what is actually acceptable with this new tech that's coming out that far strips the act's usefulness. And as a result, modders like those seen in the Big House tournament for Super Smash Bros. Melee have been slapped with DMCA claims by companies like Nintendo, as they believed that these tournaments were utilizing illegal ROM hacks, despite the fact that no one ever said that they were. There's also the fact that museums of play aren't exactly unified on how they want to save games. You have people like David Gibson of the Library of Congress who want to save every piece of gaming and memorabilia they can, but because the library doesn't allow people to freely play the games, it kind of stretches the idea that they're games and more so just cool things to look at. The complete opposite is shown by co-directors Ken McAllister and Jude Rugri of the Learning Games Initiative Research Archive, who want people to play the games freely, but ignore the fact that this will degrade the technology over time. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to go about this, but it is important to keep in mind that each approach has their own pros and cons. So what do we do about this? Well, let's start at the legal issues surrounding gaming preservation. For starters, you have things like the 2018 exemption to prohibition on circumvention of copyright protection systems for access control tech by the Library of Congress, which gives people the ability to break the online authentication for single-player titles that were just phoning home to a server for copyright protection reasons, allowing people to go into the games and preserve the data necessary in order to call it a game in the first place. You also have situations like the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association back in 2011 that video games are an art form that are protected by the First Amendment, and as such can indeed be stored, saved, and utilized no different from paintings seen in museums. You also have the issue of trying to build up an archivist team for gaming. Organizations like the Video Game History Foundation, MagFest, and the National Video Game Museum each have their own way of promoting and preserving video games from across the board, with MagFest doing this on an indie and general level, and the Video Game History Foundation going so far as to even save canceled games or blueprints. Each one has their own way of saving gaming culture, and it definitely helps one step at a time. You also have the issue of trying to bridge the gap between old traditions and disciplines with gaming. Academics like Professor Alan Turner not only work on creating games, but also conduct research in fields like sociology, religion, and anthropology to incorporate things like Black and Native American works into his role-playing games. You also have people like Norman Caruso, a historian with his YouTube channel, The Gaming Historian, utilizing their skills in history and archiving in order to preserve and let people know about gaming culture from all aspects. So, in conclusion, video games are a lifeblood for the human experience, and like the rest of the arts, should be respected, preserved, and cherished for everyone. And while the problems are vast and no solution is perfect, this is indeed a strong start to what needed to happen years ago. And the sooner we get these things put in, the better. Work to save your games. Learn what it means to buy your games physically, if it helps, and maintain your gear with things like YouTube tutorials and also just personal experience. Your voice in this fight matters. Get to social media platforms and voice your concerns. At the end of the day, I want to ask you this question though. Would you like to save your game? Thanks for listening.